Welcome everyone to this wonderful Friday, another session for the Midwest Culturally Inclusive Conference. The session this afternoon is entitled The Humanistic Elements of Inclusivity in Change Management. I'm going to go over some community standards for our conference. I will be linking the full-length version of this in the chat, but I do want to go over a few points before our session begins today. Please do not take any screenshots or photos or copy any text or information that is not your own. If you are here for professional development or for a class and you would like to take notes, write a report, that's perfectly fine. We just don't want to be sharing content that isn't our own. Please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. When you are speaking, please turn your camera on and identify yourself. Throughout the presentation, please speak clearly and slowly so that our live closed captioning service is as accurate as possible. We will be using a live closed captioning service on Zoom throughout all of our presentations. If you do not see a text box with the captions on your screen right now, you can look on your Zoom taskbar and look for the CC or More button, and then you'll want to click View Live Transcript. If you have any questions about this, please message us in the Zoom chat. Any one of our co-hosts today can help you. Most of the sessions during MCIC will be recorded. The QR code on your screen will take you to the Campus Climate YouTube page where we will be posting most of the recordings. You can feel free to pull that up on your smartphone right now if you'd like. We are recording these sessions to make them as accessible as possible for those who cannot attend live. The recordings will also be posted in Whova. If you have questions during this session or at any point throughout the conference, you can utilize the Zoom chat and message any of the co-hosts publicly or privately. You can also message Campus Climate at our email address indicated below. This will be monitored through all of the sessions and throughout the entire conference. And finally, I would like to introduce today's session, The Humanistic Elements of Inclusivity and Change Management, presented by Jonathan Yancy. Organizational change remains a constant in today's business environment. When change is introduced in an organization, there is a mixture of responses, behavioral, cognitive, etc., at the organizational and empirical level. Leaders must be agile and provide an inclusive environment where employees can make active contributions, directly or indirectly, to the change being promoted. Adopting this environment comes with implementation of change management theory and methodology to improve employee engagement, participation, and commitment to the change. I would now like to turn things over to Jonathan.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily, for that introduction. Okay, can everyone let me know when they can see my screen?
You can see it.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So this is our agenda. So what I'll do before I dive too deep in the granularity of things, I really want to give you guys like that high level overview. I don't want to get down quantitatively and kind of bog down information, but I really want to keep this high level. And I really want to create some dialogue too. So between each section, there will be a polling question. But prior to that, I do want to leave the floor open if you guys have questions or comments. I'm very receptive to that feedback, so I welcome that with open arms. I think it's super important that change management is a really hot topic right now. So a lot of people define that in different ways. I have my own definition of it, as you guys may have as well, if you know what change management even means. So I'm definitely looking forward to kind of giving you guys this information, because my hope is that when we think about inclusivity, it kind of goes beyond the lens of, like the identification, right? It's really, is this change going to impact me in my work environment? What does that look like? How do I feel inclusive? How do I feel invited to make active contributions to this change, right? Is leadership open to my thoughts, ideologies, and perspectives? Those are the kind of things I'm going to talk about today. And I can give anecdotes too from my experiences and kind of how this is relative. Okay, so as we all know, COVID has really prompted a lot of organizations to change. But prior to that, there was a lot of change going on in organizations. A lot of organizations are driving digital transformation. So when I say digital transformation, a lot of organizations transition from working in the office to work at home environments. So that came with the implementation of, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, Oracle, all of these platforms used for people to interact across the world globally, right? And so, but when we introduce change, naturally our brains go into that fight or flight mode, resistance. It creates distractions, anxieties, etc. And so that's natural, right? When leadership introduces change, there's this stigma that everyone's going to get bought in organically, and we're just going to rely on that natural effect of people just getting bought into this change. It's not really that simple, right? There's going to be a mixture of responses at the behavioral stance, cognitive and emotional, right? And what empirical level means is that those are people that are at the individual contributor level. So people making active contributions to the functional area they reside in. Organizational, I really think of that as people in upper management, leadership, senior leadership roles that have major influence in the organization. So when I say that organizational and empirical, I mean up, down, and lateral across the organization. And so when we think about change being introduced, leadership must really create an environment that's agile and flexible. We've seen a lot of organizations in the past fail at implementing change because they didn't have an agile environment that allowed employees to make contributions. It was more or less senior leadership influences change. They don't really take much feedback or have that dialogue with employees that are being dramatically impacted by it, right? So I like to think of this as, in order to align people, processes, and systems, you have to have the right behaviors in place to do that. So that's going to allow for you to invite and include individuals kind of in that decision-making process. Even if they aren't an active influencer and contributor, just someone's voice being heard is enough to say, I want to be a part of this change more than feeling like the change is happening to me, right? And then so adopting this environment enables three things that I think are super important. It increases those engagement levels, participation, and commitment to the change. And when you do all that, 9 times out of 10, your change will be successful. So before I go to the next slide, do you guys have any questions? I think silence as no, so I'm going to move on. Just stop me at any time. Okay, so my definition of change management, this is not from Google. When I went back to Platteville to get my master's in organizational change leadership, I kind of adopted my own way of thinking of what change management is. So when I think about change from a project perspective, it's going to be that human side. So there's a technical side and there's a people side of change when we think about a project that's being introduced in an organization. Really, change management methodology is really a methodology comprised of human-centric activities, systems, and processes to really guide, align, and equip individuals to be prepared for the change, right? Navigate the complex systems that come with it, right? So there are own complexities of their behaviors that they're displaying, external factors to really help them adopt successfully to that change, right? So there are 3 things that are measured when we think about change. And this is from a business perspective. We want to measure return on investment. We want to measure user adoption, and we want to measure that value realization. So when you think about all those things, that really ties into the people. Are we in a better spot than we were before? So I'm going to show you a change curve later in this slide deck, and it's going to show you there needs to be an uptick. So like post-project close, there needs to be a sense of optimization. So when you see that bell curve, you're going to see it's a little higher at the end than it was at the beginning. So what that means is that we're in a better spot than we were before, and that everyone's saying, in theory, this change is great. We should have already did this change 10 years ago, right? And then there's a reinforcement mechanism of, okay, I want to keep changing. What's that next great thing, right? So that it prompts innovation, collaboration, cohesion amongst other groups, right? So that gets into that inclusive environment when you really think about bringing together the different ideas, ideologies, and people being receptive to that, right? And having the awareness and mindfulness of everyone is different in this room, but I want to hear the latest and greatest ideas, right or wrong. I want to provide a fear-free environment where people can speak freely. and not fear of sabotage or backlash for their recommendations. And then that gets me into the first polling question. So I'll leave this here for like 2 more seconds, and then we'll get to the next polling question. Okay, so the question is, what is change management methodology comprised of? A, B, C, or D? All right, I'll give you guys a couple of more seconds. Okay, I think we're good. So I'll end the polling. So good job. Everyone got the answer right. C, it's activities, systems, and processes. And to give you guys more background on that, so a system is really, I like to compare this to a technical project. So if you think about a software development lifecycle project, it goes through different stages, right? So there's ideation, there's design, there's implementation, then there's project close, right? So within all those phases, you're gonna have some form of a change management activity tied to that, right? So that's gonna be the system, right? So when I think about that, it would be stakeholder engagement in phase 1, and then we would do communication planning, stage 2. Stage 3 will be training, because training, you're really getting into developing those new competencies and skills. And then the last phase will be just reinforcement mechanisms, right? So that ongoing training and coaching, if necessary for leadership, to continuously provide an environment of change so people can constantly evolve the way they think and the way they operate, right? Because you want to continuously evolve and you don't want to stabilize. That's how a lot of organizations fail. So that's kind of a high level example of what I would give of having the process, having the systems, and then the activities related to those. Do you guys have any questions? Okay. All right. So this kind of goes into kind of that granularity that I was talking about. So like, what are the psychological impacts of organizational change? Really, research is driving a lot towards the neuroscience of organizational change. And that's really getting into the way people think and the way people behave when they're introduced to change, right? So again, these responses are a mixture of good, bad, neutral. It doesn't really matter. I see them all as natural. So I don't necessarily get bogged down when I'm working with like a stakeholder group and they're like, I don't want to change. We've been doing things so well for so long. You're like, why do I have to change, right? So I understand the sentiment from both sides of the house, but these are always natural. And it's really hard for leadership to sometimes realize that. So I kind of make the recommendation of putting in those nurture systems, right? So nurture systems are like focus groups, one-on-one meetings, team huddles. It's ways to have people discuss their thoughts and perceptions freely, kind of in that fear-free environment that I was talking about, right? And then, so as I said, neuroscience has a stronger emphasis on the research and the change management space. And there's really 4 things that our brains immediately gravitate towards when we think about change. I admittedly fall into 2 of these categories. And it would be change or ambiguity and distraction, anxiety, and fear. And the reason for that is I'm a change practitioner, right? I'm at the generalist level. I'm not really seasoned yet. But anytime I think of change, it is ambiguous, right? Because we can have the greatest change management roadmap. We can have this great project plan. but it's really on an agile iteration basis, right? We know things are going to change. We know things are going to come up. We know people are going to be resistant, right? We're going to have a lag in the activities that we want to pursue, right? So we may have a critical path. We may have identified due dates, but is this feasible? Is this tangible? Are we going to get there? Yes, but things are going to come up, right? So you have to be adaptable and flexible as those things come up. And the reason I experience ambiguity is because I'm more or less, in a good way, concerned with how people are going to react to this change. What's going to be the good? What's going to be the bad? What's going to be the neutral? And for me, I try answering 3 questions, but I can't answer these until I go through an entire stakeholder analysis process. It's really, people need to understand 3 things to create a meaningful image of what the change is and what it means to them. And so those 3 things are, what am I losing? What am I gaining? And what am I keeping? If I can answer those 3 things, I'm going to craft a meaningful vision of what this change actually is, right? And it's going to entice me more to be engaged. It's going to entice me to do more research, work with my team, wanting to be more involved in this process, right? It doesn't matter what level I am in the organization. If I feel like I can positively impact this project and push it forward, I'm going to do that, right? So that naturally, that's an anecdote for me, right? But distraction, anxiety, and fear, on the other token, is me not knowing what backlash am I going to get, right? I work a lot with executive leadership, and I get a lot of backlash of, Jonathan, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be a part of this. My team functions well. We don't need this new technology, right? We don't need to do a process optimization, right? Well, you may not, right? But we've identified this as a strategic pillar to get your organization to that next level, to produce a new product or service, right, in that niche market, like all that stuff. So it kind of goes beyond kind of what leadership wants, and it's really just kind of, this is what makes the most sense for the organization, right? And how this ties into like the overall strategy, right? Because I really think that when organizations set goals, it's really to be more competitive in the market, right? But it's also to streamline operational efficiencies and make employees more productive and improve their overall well-being. So it's just not to increase the balance sheet. It's more or less to positively impact other elements of the organization that are critical to like the day-to-day, right? Do you guys have any questions about that? Cool. All right, polling question number 2. All right, so I'll read this out. What feature is a common response to the way our brains react to change? A, B, C, or D?
Hey, Jonathan, we have some folks who are participating via Chrome or Chromebooks, and for some reason the polling doesn't work across Zoom, so we might not have all of the participants be able to engage with the question. Sorry about that.
Nope. No, it's perfectly fine. So that makes sense. So I'll look for this number that I see on my screen. So yeah, so we should be good. So we have all participants. So all right, perfect. The answer is D. Nice job, everyone. All right. Do you guys have any questions about that? Okay. All right, so this gets into that change curve I was talking about. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about ADCAR. So ADCAR stems from ProSci. I have used the ADCAR methodology approach in the last like year and a half. I really started doing more research, and I started employing it on various engagements I've had with clients. And so a lot of people gravitate towards this, and a lot of employers want you to have like that CCMP or like that ADCAR certification, because this really drives a lot of the project execution, right? Project success, all that stuff. And so ADCAR can be used at the empirical and organizational level. Really what this tool, what the ADCAR model is used for, it's really used to diagnose how ready are we for this change, right? pre and post change, right? So you can really develop this entire before action or after action report. And there's 5 components of it, and I can give a hot definition of each one. So awareness is you understand what's changing. You understand why the change is happening, how it'll happen, how it's going to impact your job. You understand the rationale, right? So you understand what, why, how, and when, right? Those big key areas. Whereas desire, it's more or less, you have a desire, you have like that inkling to want to be a part of this change, right? To whatever capacity that allows you to do so. You really want to be influential, and you really want to drive the work, and you want to be hands-on, I like to call it hands to keyboard, really executing the tactical day-to-day change stuff. But strategically, if you're in a leadership role, how can you further push this change, right? And further get people to be more engaged, committed, and to participate and support the change, right? Knowledge, I really think of knowledge as like a organizational design component. And when I say that, I mean, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a change in the way someone does something when change is introduced. 9 times out of 10, right? So knowledge to me is me knowing that I have the skills and competencies to perform my role today efficiently. But I also feel as if I have the appropriate resources internally and externally, and the support from my team to be able to do my job well in the new organizational norm, whatever that looks like, right? So knowledge is really saying I have the competencies and skills to effectively service the customer now, and I will into the future, right? But that's going to be, it's going to be critical for leadership to arm people with the appropriate training, right? Whatever that delivery methodology is, right? Or I need people to understand how to drive certain activities, right? So it really is like a knowledge transfer. And just my recommendation to leadership is really, if you can do things in person, obviously COVID kind of prevents some of that, but really you get the most out of like your training activities when you have people in person. And a lot of people are better hands-on learners, right? So I can talk to this for like 10 hours, but you guys would understand this more unless you're actually implementing this ADCAR model like an actual project. So you understand the entire life cycle in its entirety, right? So that's really knowledge, knowing, having those competencies and skills to perform at a high level before and post change. And then ability is really just, you can sustain this level of change, right? You have the ability to be adaptable and flexible when another change gets introduced to the organization, right? So you're experimental, like, you know, you want to make decisions, all those new things. You're getting acclimated with the new way of doing things. You're getting acclimated with the new status quo, right? And then reinforcement. Reinforcement is so critical. I think these other things fall by the wayside if there isn't reinforcement, because you can implement a change successfully all day long. But from a project perspective, a lot of people look at the project scope, the project budget, resource allocation, cost, right? Cost benefit analysis, all that stuff. All those things that are important from a project perspective, right? You want to stay in budget. You want to make sure you deliver the project as quickly and efficiently as possible, right? And you hit that target due date. Well, you can meet the project all day long and execute on it effectively. But if you look at the people side and all you did was drag them across the goal line, how effective was that change in reality, right? Because you need the right behaviors in place to get the right inputs and then to maximize the outputs of the systems, processes, and technologies that you have in place, right? So that's why I think it's super important a change is only as successful as the people involved in it, right? And if you are just bogging down your employees and dragging them through this change and not really incentivizing them to be a part of it, and rather than it happening to them, you know, that's to a lot of organizations' detriment. And I've seen that firsthand anecdotally where organizations really failed, you know, after the fact. You know, I would check in and do a pulse check and say, hey, how are things going? It's like, well, hey, man, my team we have this new technology, but just no one loves it, right? You know, no one's vested in it and all this other stuff. So they're not getting the most out of their new ERP system, right, that they put in, if we're talking about manufacturing, right? So do you guys have any questions about this? And then this is the change curve. This is similar to the 5 stages of grief. And so an example I like to use here for this, and this is relative to the ADCAR model too as well, is let's say you have a spouse, right? And your spouse tells you they want a divorce. And initially you're going to be in shock, you're going to be surprised, but you're probably thinking, you're probably going to be in denial. You're probably going to say, that's not happening. They're not going to leave me. We've been together too long. It's not happening. Over time, you start to see, whoa, this change is actually happening. This is real. And then you get into a point of frustration, low mode, lack of energy, probably depression, a little bit of anxiety, trying to figure out a way forward. But after time, you're going to be in the, I call it valley of despair. You're going to be where that depression is, deep in the curve. But at some point, you're going to get experimental. You're going to say, all right, cool. I'm ready to get back out there. I'm going to download the Tinder app. I'm going to download the latest dateme.com app, like whatever that is, right? You're going to get experimental. And then at some point, you're going to make a decision to date someone else. And then once you reach that point of integration, you're going to look back and say, this was for the best, right? Why didn't we divorce earlier, right? You know, I'm speaking from the model, right? You probably won't have that initially, but over time you realize this was probably the best decision for you, right? But it was hard to realize that early on in that process, right? So that's the example that I like to use most because it's relative to most people. Probably not everybody on this call, but I use that a lot with organizations and it resonates with them pretty well. So do you guys have any questions about that?
Hey, Jonathan, sorry, I actually have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and just kind of looking at like, yeah, just like the spectrum of emotions. So is this kind of why it's usually not recommended to mandate, especially things like DEI trainings or initiatives and stuff like that, just because if you're not going to like help people understand the why behind the doing it or why the changes are being implemented?
Yeah, and Kaden, that's a great question. And I would say that because there's so many complexities, I'll be transparent. In my previous life at the other organization I work with, there was a push for DE&I, right? And so the DE&I manager, one of his responsibilities was to work with leadership, right? So if we want to drive more DE&I initiatives, I need to understand the unconscious biases that are at the leadership level. Right. So he was doing this, going through a series of interviews. We created employee resource groups, which were extremely helpful. But it got to a point where leadership got really uncomfortable. And they started to realize how much work it actually was to implement some of this DE&I stuff, right? And then so unfortunately, you know, that person lost their role. And I honestly left the organization because of that, because there's a need for this, there's a desire for this, but a lot of organizations placate the word DE&I, right? But the massive amounts of energy it takes to actually implement those and actually stand by those words, it takes a lot, right? So I think that's why a lot of organizations struggle saying, this is what we're going to do from a DE&I perspective, because there are, unfortunately, unconscious biases, right? There are barriers that are just in the way naturally that people have a hard time removing, right? And that trickles down throughout the organization's entirety. So does that help answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Any other questions? Okay. Polling question number 3. The change curve is often compared to A, B, C, or D. Okay, Kaden, I think we are good on responses. Awesome. Yep, the answer is C, 5 stages of grief. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about are the humanistic elements of inclusivity. So when I think about this, my mind immediately goes to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So when we think of that at a basic level, it's like food, water, shelter, like just the basic things of the Maslow's hierarchy. but it goes beyond that, right? So really the hierarchy is intended to kind of track the growth of human beings. So if we think about this psychologically, it's really the growth from birth all the way until whatever that mature age is, right? Like, how do we grow? And so I really think the elements of this that are vital to maximizing these humanistic elements in an inclusive environment is self-actualization. Self-actualization is, I value this a lot, and I actually think about this from a career standpoint. I'll give you an example. So when I think about my career, self-actualization to me is doing the most, it's not always going to be this way daily, but doing the most fulfilling and meaningful work. And it gets to a point where it doesn't feel like work anymore, right? I value what I'm doing. I'm extremely passionate about it, right? I want to do this forever, right? You know, I take my work home with me. I don't literally, but like that's the mentality, right? You just have these off the charts, exponential high satisfaction levels that just can't be matched in any other role, right? So you've reached that point of optimization where you're happy with your role, you're happy with everything going on in your life, right? And then another thing that bleeds into that is belonging, right? So I think having a sense of love and belonging is so important. And I know I'm speaking from an organizational context, but this can be applicable to your personal life as well, where if you have a sense of love and belonging and knowing that what you're doing is impactful and meaningful and adding value, speaking from an organizational perspective again, that creates dopamines. That sends dopamines to your brain, and that allows you to just produce extraordinary results to the best of your ability, right? So these three things resonate with me, and I think they're so true, right? Just going through a multiple of industries, just doing consultation, these are the three things that I think really drive people to be inclusive and to really produce their best work when they're hit with change. And then the last thing is safety needs, right? You feel safe, secure, stabilized, fear-free environment. And what that means is when you hear about change, there may be job insecurities, right? You may not know if you have a job in this new organizational norm. You may not know what the reporting structure looks like. You may not know who your new boss is, right? You know, you don't know who your new team is. If you're getting moved to a new department, well, what's my team? What are the team dynamics, right? You know, what are their pain points, right? What is their culture, right? What values and beliefs do they have in place? You know, how do I mirror that? I want to know the people I work with, right? So I think when you put all these things in conjunction, this really is going to drive an inclusive environment and really help leadership reach that point of satisfaction levels that are required to get people to feel more inclusive and more engaged in change. Do you guys have any questions about that? I know that's kind of a lot to take in. It's very psychological, but I wanted to speak to that at the highest level and just give you guys time to digest and ask me any questions you may have. Okay. That brings me to polling question number 4. What elements are vital to maximizing humanistic elements in achieving inclusion? A, B, C, or D? Awesome. The correct answer is C. All right, so I talked a lot about leadership and what they need to do. So you're probably like, Jonathan, well, what's the call to action here? What do they actually need to do to create an inclusive environment? And I'll tell you, right? So in order for leadership to do this, they're gonna have to drive 4 key things. They're gonna have to drive autonomy. And in autonomy, you feel like you can operate freely under minimal guidance and direction in this new org norm, and you feel like you have the skills and competencies to perform at the highest levels. That's autonomy. Autonomy to me is being able to execute on my work with minimal supervision, but then also strategically knowing when I'm not spinning my wheels and when to ask for help, because I really value feedback. So if there's something I'm struggling with, it's more or less do my due diligence, do that research up front, but then go back and get realigned if I have any questions, right? So that's autonomy. That to me is an inclusive environment. You have people willing to roll up their sleeves, be autonomous and do the dirty work, but also come back up and strategically say, what's next, right? How are we going to add value to this client, right? The next part is cohesion. I really think this kind of taps into the inclusive environment. The more I go through this, the more I go through these definitions, it's really people operating in uniformity. It really creates a sense of camaraderie and involvingness. And what I mean by that is you bring in different people, different backgrounds, different thoughts, perceptions, educational backgrounds, work backgrounds. You're bringing all these people in, and really the cohesion comes from, I'm aware there's a lot of differences in the room, but I'm also aware these people may have a lot of great ideas that I'm not even thinking about. So I oftentimes go into meetings just to listen. I may have to lead and facilitate 90% of them, but I really like to hear other people's opinions, right or wrong. I want to know what's on your mind, right? That's going to enable you to, one, open up more, be in that fear-free environment where you don't feel like you have to reserve information, right? You can speak freely and not be fearful of, critical feedback, right? So all that stuff. So I really think cohesion is super important for individuals, teams, and groups to really express their thoughts about change and really what are the value added actionable items we can do as a team to kind of push this forward from our department perspective, right? And how does that align with the organizational goals, et cetera? And then the next thing is innovation. I think you get the greatest ideas through, like, I call them mind mapping or brainstorming sessions. It's literally where you take a sticky note. And I did this, I think, like 2 weeks ago. I took sticky notes and I just put them on this back wall. I was trying to figure out a way to build out like a change network. And my mind was going in a million different places, but I like had blue sticky notes, red sticky notes, like yellow ones. That was innovation to me. But I also pinged my buddy next to me and said, hey, can you come in here? So he put more sticky notes up on the wall. So we had like half this wall filled of just different ideas, right? And just like, I'm like, what's going to be the most value add for this client, right? From a change network perspective, how are we going to build this out? Tactically, what are the steps we need to take? Strategically, what does this look like, right? What is the initiative and all that other stuff? And then the biggest thing is receptivity. I think if you have high levels of mindfulness, again, of awarenesses and differences in a group, then you're going to be receptive to their thoughts, perceptions, and ideologies as well, right? So you're going to welcome anybody else's feedback candidly, right? And you're going to listen to them, you're going to digest, and then you're going to make the appropriate recommendations. And I think, in my opinion, I think that when you enable these things, naturally you're going to create that fear-free environment where individuals feel they can provide those recommendations and actively feel a part of the change rather than change happening to them. That's kind of my slogan. You really want people to feel a part of the change and not feel like the change is happening to them. Because when you feel a part of something greater than yourself, you're gonna do some amazing things, and you're just going to say, "Wow, I didn't think I can actually do this, and I'm bought into this change. I'm all about it. What's next? Give me more." Right? That's the mentality. Do you guys have any questions about that? Okay. Polling question number 5. Which of the following is not an attribute that enables an inclusive environment? A, B, C, or D? Okay. I think we're good. Awesome. Yeah, the answer is A. Nice job, guys. Okay, like I said, this is gonna be, I didn't think this would take the entire hour, but I really wanted to leave this open dialogue. If you guys so choose, I really welcome the feedback, critical or positive. what your thoughts were, what your key learnings were, what your takeaways were. That's really important to me. I really wanted to just shine a different light on inclusion and what that looks like from a change management perspective, but really diving more into kind of that neuroscience and that human psychology a little bit, because it's really a rising topic. So that's kind of what I leaned on for this presentation. So I'm opening it up to the floor. Caden, keep an eye on the chat for me, I guess, while I have my screen like this, but just let me know if you guys have any questions. I really want to hear your thoughts. And if not, I can give you guys some time back. All right, I see someone has their hand raised.
I think it's me.
Okay, yeah, okay, yep,
Okay.
it is. Cool.
I'm on a small phone, so I can't see a lot of things either.
Oh, that's okay.
So I'm new to the organization. I actually work at Platteville as in the marketing communications department, but I've only been here about 3 months. And my background is in nonprofits, which are always changing and restructuring. And I've had some really insanely psychologically terrifying, experiences with those. But this is it's a difficult time. So I guess my question is, with the pandemic and with the racial reckoning, what are some trends that you're seeing with organizations trying to evolve to meet the needs of people maybe coming back into the office after the pandemic, but also balancing the needs to sort of integrate social justice language or more racially inclusive language into their business model or sort of organizational model? So the question is, have you seen any trends about sort of integrating those two things into just even how people are doing business now?
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak to the organization I'm with now. So right now we just lifted the mask mandate if you live in the Madison, Wisconsin area. So it's encouraged for people to come back into the office, but we've also realized the criticality of work-life balance. So it's completely optional. So people kind of set up these programs where it's just, you have the option to come into the office 1 day a week, 2 days a week, or just full-time entirely. Or the other option is to just stay home entirely or do a mixture of both, right? So I really think it's organizations getting away from that systematized way of going about things and having that governance and really saying what's going to be helpful for the overall employee well-being. Because if I can do my job effectively in the office, which I'm in the office now, and I can just perform it at the same level at home, it shouldn't matter where I'm working globally. And I think a lot of leadership are tackling that mentality of, as long as you're getting your work done, I'm gonna get away from the micromanaging. I'm gonna get away from everything, right? I hired you to do a job and I trust you're going to do it, right? So there's that rapport, that relationship, that all that stuff that goes into that. And I've seen a lot of organizations are really driving that, but it's so hard to create hybrid environments because there are technology impairments that kind of come with that. So they may not have the latest and greatest resources, right? They may still be using Skype rather than Zoom or Microsoft Teams or WebEx to have virtual meetings. So it may force people to kind of come back into the office naturally, right? Because they don't have all that functionality or they don't have the bandwidth, Wi-Fi to connect to meetings, and they're just having a terrible time administratively doing their day-to-day job. So it's easier to go into the office and do all that stuff. And from a social justice perspective, they've created these opportunities. They call them DE&I sessions. They've created sessions where people can kind of come in and talk about social injustice that's going on. Like example, Russia and Ukraine, right? That's going on. They've actually had multiple call to actions in terms of just really helping the people there. And like the way we do business, right? There's a big four firm, and because I work in consulting, so I can only speak to this. There's a big four firm. I'm not sure if it's, don't quote me on this. It may be PwC or Boston Consulting Group. I'm not sure, but there's a big Deloitte. There's a big consulting firm that actually stopped doing business in Russia just for the simple fact of what's going on, right? So that's another example of people taking the next step in terms of social injustices. And I've seen they've had opportunities where people can come to events and kind of talk about, if they want, their feelings, right? And what their thoughts are. And they take that feedback and bring it to leadership. and leadership strategically figures out, okay, where do we actually want to go with these DE&I initiatives, right? So like the George Floyd case, like it goes all the way back to that. Like I've seen organizations taking massive leaps, but it takes an army, and it's not easy. So when I say massive amounts of energy, I've witnessed firsthand someone trying to push the needle in the right direction, but leadership felt extremely uncomfortable and they diverted back to the old way of doing things, which was fine. But it's some people are ready to take that jump, some people aren't. And that's just unfortunate, but that's the society we live in. So I've seen organizations taking massive steps, but there's still a ton of work that needs to be done. I hope that helps answer your question.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem.
I had a quick question, Jonathan, about kind of related to your last polling question. So you had shared earlier that your colleague was trying to push the needle, trying to provide some like strategic initiative and structure for folks moving towards DEI and social justice, but the organization like backtracked and was uncomfortable. So from what you've shared, what I'm hearing is that having a subject expert on spot isn't the thing that is like the cornerstone of making these initiatives advance. It's those elements, but it does help to have somebody guide those principles, right? Like had your colleague been able to guide while leadership was embodying those elements, are you saying that it would have been more successful?
Yeah, I absolutely believe that, right? So, but again, that falls back on leadership and that intentionality of wanting to build that environment out, right? And actually driving that.
Hi, Jonathan. This is Chuck Steiner. I'm in the College of Bill. So when I was interested in your change curve and when you were going through that, I think ideally as leaders, as we're seeing change in a large institution, we'd love to see everybody moving through that change curve at the same time. But obviously people move through that at different speeds. Right. Any recommendations or input you would have? I mean, as you're moving through and changes are occurring and you know there's people that are at different levels of that change curve, how do you ensure that you're still doing the right things to make sure people feel that it's an inclusive process, knowing that there's people that are further back in that change curve than those that are the early adopters, using a kind of a different business term?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I look at that, I have a customized approach, right? So to your point, everyone's going to be, some people may be high energy day one, some people may not want to be about this change, but that could totally flip, like when the change is implemented, right? So the approach I like to have is I like to put in place these nurture systems, which is kind of what I alluded to earlier, where you have like weekly stand-ups, you have focus groups or one-on-one meetings with your department groups, right? So this provides people the option to express their thoughts freely to leadership or to their direct supervisor and really say how they feel, right? Because me being able to talk to you and say, this is how I'm feeling, these are my pain points, you know, what resources do you have for me, right? And the resource can just simply, you just be a sounding board and just simply listening, being receptive, being mindful. I think oftentimes leadership is so focused on pushing the needle, moving the needle forward, they forget about the people. Well, the people are helping drive this work, right? So what do you need to do for them to support them? And that support's going to look different for each person. It's not going to be the same. But if you put in place these communication cadences where you're tapping into the pulse of your team, you're doing these weekly or monthly pulse checks, you're going to know if you're pushing that needle forward. So if we were on the downside of this curve earlier, are we moving up? In theory, we're going to be moving up, or we're going to stay where we are, right? But we want to move up in an optimized way. But that takes time, right? So what I've realized is that, you know, change doesn't feel real until you get closer to it, right? So a lot of things are kind of just in la la land. Everything is fictitious. Change doesn't feel real. But when it's actually there, like day one, the day before, everyone's like, whoa, this change is real. This is happening. I don't want to do this anymore. And they're going to revert back, right? But if you have those nurture systems in place, people know that they have that open door policy to go talk to leadership, to go talk to their management about that. And so that's always been our recommendation. It's been a customized approach, but I really think having those nurture systems, give people that inclusive environment, give people that safety net, give them a sense of belongingness, which is super important. And that over time, you hope that those people understand why this change is important. The biggest thing is understanding what I'm losing, what I'm gaining, and what I'm keeping. If I understand those three things, I'm going into that conversation not without any reservations, and I'm being open and transparent. So that's my recommendation, is leadership to put in those nurture systems so they have those safety nets and they can continue to provide that guidance and support that people really need to kind of get across the goal line, but continuously want to change over time, right? It doesn't stop there. That's a reinforcement mechanism that I would recommend.
Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else?
Hi, Jonathan. This is Amy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
If I remember correctly, earlier you mentioned you got your master's degree from UW-Platteville, right?
Yeah.
Organizational leadership. So would you highlight what was the program, probably the most influential part in your academic pursuit in this leadership organizational change? I mean, I know you obviously yourself from your life, probably you have already accumulated lots of those knowledge and experience and skills. But that program, what was kind of the cornerstone that you got from that program? I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if Dr. Stanley is on the call, but I'm sure she'll appreciate this. I think the cornerstone moment for me was when I initially enrolled in the program. I was in, I think, Introduction to Organizational Change Management Theory and like leadership. I don't remember the name of the course exactly, but in that course specifically, I connected with so many people from a variety of industries. They were leaders, they were individual contributors, healthcare, manufacturing, law enforcement. It didn't matter. I learned so much from the people on the other side of the screen than I did actually doing like my individual assignments. I learned so much more in group projects. So I would say that was a cornerstone for me, is realizing there's a ton of people here with a ton of experience and I can leverage their approach to change and make that applicable, and I can put my own spin on it, right? Because I'm still new to this whole change thing. So just being a sponge and absorbing all that information allowed me to build a meaningful network. And I would just say that it's just really the people that I work with across different industries, 10 years, 15, 20 years, and I've been doing this for like 3.5 years. I gained value in the connections that I built throughout my master's program. So that's why I'm always an advocate for this program, because the professors create an inclusive environment, but they also provide a rigorous structure that allows you to think outside the box. But they're also there for support too as well. So I would say that's a cornerstone for me, was the connections that I made and just thinking about things at a different light and in different industries from the people that I work with.
Thank you. That's excellent. I enjoy listening to your presentation, and I know it's not easy to convey such a actually very broad concept, but you're able to use very concrete and wonderful examples, and I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any final questions or comments for Jonathan?
All right. Well, I want to thank you guys so much, Emily, Caden especially, for really helping me ease into this. This has been really insightful for me. Just kind of the questions you guys asked me, I'm already thinking about the answers I gave you, and I'm thinking about how I can build upon them and just really see how I can apply that to my job. So I would say that's just an example of me just really being receptive to everyone in this room. So I really appreciate you guys giving me the platform to talk about this stuff. It's really complex, but it's going to continue to be a hot topic for the next 3 to 5 years. And so thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Emily and Caden, I don't know if there's anything else you guys need from me, but this has been a blast. Even though I've been talking at a screen, I like being in person, but I really enjoyed this so much. I really did.
Yeah, thank you for being here so much, Jonathan. This was awesome.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you guys so much. Feel free to reach out to me if you guys have any questions. I'll drop my email in the chat if you guys want to discuss the conversation further. But thank you guys so much. And you guys enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great weekend. It's supposed to be 60 degrees tomorrow, so make sure you get outside if you can.